Story 49. I caught my mom in an affair that literally killed my dad. It's been 12 years since I, 14 male at the time, went out with some of my friends during the summer between junior high and high school. We would normally hang out at the mall, mainly at the food court near one of the gaming centers. We spent tons of time there. I had money since I had a part-time job helping at my uncle's business. My mom has been a stay-at-home mom since I was born. She was a secretary at a large company and used to hang out with many of her former office friends. She had recently considered returning to work since I was older enough to take care of myself after school and didn't need my mom at home to babysit me. She had even talked about returning to work at her former company and had done some interviews. My dad had an office job that was like clockwork. He got up every morning at the same time, made breakfast, and left for his job. He returned every night at the same time. Some weeks, he would go into the office on a Saturday for a half day when required. He was a perfect role model for me. He loved my mom, cared for us, and made enough money to give us a good life. We had a nice house in a good neighborhood, and he purchased my mom the car she always wanted. We took yearly vacations, and my dad was always available for me, like watching me when I was playing Little League Baseball. One weekday during summer break, my uncle called me and told me the job we were supposed to work that day had been delayed a day due to a delivery mistake. I called some friends who didn't have jobs and headed down to our favorite hangout at the mall. After spending a few hours there, I headed home. My house was about 30 minutes from the mall, so I normally walked. Still not old enough to drive. There was a way to cut through a hedgerow separating our house from a sidewalk that I used because it dumped me out directly into the driveway near the garage. As I stepped through the bushes, I ended up standing near the rear quarter panel of a nice car parked in our driveway. As I looked at the car, I could see the car was occupied. I was shocked to see a guy with his seat reclined back with his eyes closed and my mom leaning over him from the passenger side with her head in his lap. She was fully engaged in giving this guy head. I stood there at the side of the car, looking at them. This guy had one hand in her hair as she bobbed up and down, and his other hand reached across squeezing her ass. Stunned, I'm just standing there, shocked and frozen at what I see. As I was trying to process what was going on, the guy pulled her up into a kiss, and then she started pulling at the dress she was wearing. Just as she's getting her dress up past her waist, the guy looks around to make sure none of the neighbors are outside watching. He looks over his shoulder and notices me standing there with my mouth wide open. He yelled something, and my mom turned to face me, locking eyes with me. I could see the horror on her face, then she started screaming. Her voice was muffled because the door was closed, and the windows were up. As we're staring at each other, her tears start flowing. My brain finally processed what was happening, and get the hell out of Dodge mode kicked in. As the car door opened, I took off running as fast as I could. She tried to catch me, but it wasn't much of a chase since I was a 14-year-old teenage boy and my mom was a mid-30s housewife. After getting a couple of streets away, I slowed to a walk and started making my way back to the mall. I was about halfway there when my mom pulled alongside me in her car like a crazy person and jumped out to confront me. She stood in the street yelling at me about how I was supposed to be at work, demanding to know what I was doing at home. Then she launched into this. It's a misunderstanding, and she can explain everything. I never said a word to her, I just stood there looking at her. It was surreal. Even after all these years, this is hard to write. My mom then starts crying again, asking me to let her explain and not talk to Dad about it. I just kept looking at her without being able to find my voice. Then she told me to get into the car, so I turned and walked away. Mom is running next to me, grabbing my arm, and is now sobbing and trying to use her mom voice to get me to come home. Eventually, I ran away again, forcing her to return to her car. I cut through some yards and made my way to the mall without seeing her again. I hid at the mall and waited until my dad was about to leave work. It normally took him about 30 to 45 minutes to get home, so I called him just before he got off work. When he answered the phone, he sounded happy and asked me, "What's up?" This was my last memory of my dad being happy, and it was from just hearing my voice. I stammered for a few seconds, unable to find words. He interrupted me and asked if I was okay. I told him no and paused again, trying to order my thoughts. He sounded worried, so I told him I was about to walk home from the mall and wanted to meet him at the house. He asked me to explain what was going on, and I told him that I needed to talk to him before he went into the house to see Mom. He paused and said okay and told me to wait for him near the house, and we'd chat privately as soon as we got home. I hurried home to make sure that I was there before Dad. I only beat my dad home by a few minutes, so he must have been speeding on his way home. He pulled up in his car, and I walked over and got into the passenger side. I asked him if he could drive, and he said okay. Mom came running out of the house just as we were driving away. My dad could tell I didn't want my mom present, so he rolled down the window and told her he would talk with me and be home later. My mom was in panic mode and told him, no. That we needed to have a family discussion, but my dad told her to go back into the house and drove away. We ended up heading down to the baseball park used for Little League. We sat in the bleachers. My dad said it was okay to say whatever I needed. He could tell I was having problems finding words, so he just told me to start at the beginning of whatever was bugging me. I looked at him and told him he was going to be upset. He nodded and said, that's fine, let's just talk about it and see if we can work through it. I retold what had happened earlier that day. He was shocked, and I could see his anger and even disbelief. He asked me to start over, go slow, and tell me all the details as hard as it was to say. I went over what had happened, and he coaxed me into explaining even more detail, like asking questions about the guy, the car, and what the guy looked like. By the time we had finished, he looked like he was chiseled from stone. He didn't show any emotion other than tears running down his cheeks. We sat there for another hour or so, and my dad said very little except that he loved me and that it would be okay. He squeezed my shoulder, and when we stood up to return to the car, he gave me a big dad hug. I started crying, and we must have been there for a half hour or so before I cried out. I had never seen my dad shed any tears, and it broke me to see him standing there with wet cheeks. I could see the sadness in his eyes, but he was back to being my dad. We got into the car and headed home. When we got out of the car, my dad told me to go pack a bag and come back to the car. He told me to ignore my mom and he'd take care of that. When my dad's hand touched the door handle, the door flew open, and my mom was there demanding to know what was happening. My dad walked right through my mom, who had to stumble out of his way so she didn't fall. I walked behind him, and when I looked at her, she demanded to know what I had told him. I ignored her and went to my room to grab some clothes. My dad walked into the kitchen, and my mom followed him, demanding to know what I had told him. I could hear the conversation as clear as day. My dad told my mom that I had given him a full recap of what I witnessed with her and the guy. She started crying, saying I was mistaken and didn't see anything. My dad recounted all the details I had given him word for word, like it was burned into his memory. My mom was now bawling, saying she could explain and that it didn't mean anything, and then went into some rant about how she felt so alone. My dad, for the first time in my memory, raised his voice at my mom and shouted her down with cold hard facts and verbally destroyed her. He went over everything he had done for the family and that she had everything she ever asked for. He started asking questions and demanding answers that backed her into a corner and made her ultimately admit to everything. Her crying was so loud and distorted by her sobbing that I couldn't understand most of what she was saying. I grabbed my bag and walked out to the front door. My mom saw me and came over with fury in her eyes. She screamed at me that I ruined our family and slapped my face. As soon as she did that, my dad was at her side and grabbed her hand as she prepared to slap me again. He spun her around to face him, put his face an inch away from hers, and told her that if she touched me again, he'd end her. Mom turned white in shock and looked back and forth between me and my dad, saying she was sorry. My dad threw her hand away, making her spin in a circle. I left the house and went to his car. It took my dad another 10 minutes before he walked out with a large suitcase and a bag. We drove to my uncle's house, and my dad explained to my uncle what had happened, not leaving out anything. We ended up staying with my uncle until my dad was able to get a rental. We moved into that a couple of weeks later. My dad never spoke to my mom again that I'm aware of. He got a lawyer and filed for divorce. The house was sold, they divided their assets, and my dad moved on with his life. I know it broke something inside of him. He was never that same man. But that didn't matter for long. My mother returned to work at a different company a couple of months after we left the house. My dad was able to find out who her AP was, and it turned out to be her former boss. During the divorce proceedings, the judge asked me which parent I preferred to live with. I asked him if I could be honest with him, and he looked me in the eyes and said, "Yes, son, you can." I told the judge that I would live with my father regardless of what the court ruled. I told him that under no circumstances would I ever live in the same house with my mom. I then told him everything I saw that day and how it was burned into my brain. I expressed how it had broken something in my father. I told him that my mother had stopped being family to me that day when I caught her cheating on us with AP. Then I told him that my mom had struck me and was preparing to hit me again, forcing my dad to stop her. My dad had never brought this up during the proceedings, and the judge looked shocked. When he looked at my dad, I saw tears in his eyes for the second time in my life. He asked my dad if what I said was true, and my dad choked out a yes. My mother started bawling, and her attorney was whispering in her ear. When the judge asked my mom if that was true, she said it was and that she was sorry. I looked at my dad, then my mom, and told the judge I wanted nothing to do with her. When the judge looked back at me, he said that I would be free to live with my dad and that I was old enough to decide how much my mother would be part of my life. I'd love to say that we all went our separate ways and lived happily ever after, but that's not the case. My mom once had the gall to blame me for their divorce. I cut my mother out of my life because I blame her 100% for what happened to our family, including my dad's death. After the trial, my dad decided to tell AP's wife what had happened. Dad went to their house a week or so after the divorce and knocked on the door. AP's wife was home, and my dad told her what had happened and gave her a copy of their divorce documents. AP showed up at my dad's office the next day and hit my dad multiple times with a baseball bat as he was walking from his car to the office. Some of his co-workers were able to intervene, and AP was arrested. My dad developed sepsis and died of septic shock just days after surgery on his head wound. AP was tried and convicted for the assault and manslaughter because he died in the hospital from the infection. I stayed in touch with my cousins and aunt on my mom's side. My cousin told me that when my mom found out about my dad's death, she lost it. I don't know the specifics because I choose not to know, but my cousin told me that she took his death hard. She tried to reach out to me at his funeral, and I raged at her for destroying our family, blaming her for my dad's death. My relatives had to restrain me until she was ejected from the funeral. Even though he died from complications in the hospital from being attacked by her AP, she killed my dad with her affair. I will never forgive her. I believe that with all my heart. There was one update, 3 years after the original post. It's been almost 15 years since I caught my mom cheating, and I've cut her out of my life completely. She has missed out on my college graduation, my wedding, and the birth of my 2 daughters. Over the years, my aunt or others on her side of the family would try to intercede and get me to agree to talk to my mom. I said no every single time she asked to contact me. Then, during the run-up to this Christmas, my mother reached out to me directly and begged me to allow her to meet my wife and kids. My wife, who is a devout Christian, and I talked about it for a couple of weeks. She never tried to force the issue, but I could see that she wanted this wound I had been carrying for so long to be healed. We decided to allow her to meet them, with the caveat that she never mentioned that she was my mom and their grandmother. I insisted that I had to choose the date and location. I chose the Forest Lawn Cemetery, where my father was buried. I gave her directions to the plot, but she said she already knew the location. I could tell she was unhappy with my demand but had no choice. I told her I would be there on the anniversary of his death at a specific time with my wife and daughters for 30 minutes. I told her that it was her decision to make it or not. My mother was already at the plot, and fresh flowers were at the base of the headstone. When we arrived, she was standing in front of his headstone, crying. She looked up as we approached and tried to initiate a hug that I avoided. I introduced her to my wife using only her name. My wife shook her hand and introduced our daughters to my mom by name. To her credit, my mom stuck to the agreement and greeted them, reciting their names as she knelt to shake their hands, saying hello to each of them and commenting that they were very pretty young ladies. My mom still looked like my mom, but she had aged more than I had expected. There were deep lines on her face, and she was significantly thinner. Mom and I walked a few yards off, and I told her now was the time to say whatever was on her mind. My mom had a look of dread on her face. She started off slow and eased into the conversation, complimenting me on my family. She then asked how I was doing, to which I told her my family was doing well. This was her time, so I felt she could use the next 15 minutes however she wanted. Eventually, she asked if I would be open to reestablishing our relationship. She quickly interjected that she would expect it to be a slow process to make me feel more comfortable. I didn't say anything to her, so she seemed to take that as neutral. In reality, I was doing my best not to explode on her. I may be the a-hole for this, but things have not changed. She was directly responsible for the death of my dad by having an affair. Her lover attacked my dad by essentially killing him with a bat. The fact he tried and succeeded in killing my dad was because he was going to lose his family and life. To me, that means that he didn't even value my mom over his wife. This means that to him, this affair was just a fling. The fact my mom tried to fight the divorce meant to me that she wasn't in love with her AP. That means my dad was killed because his value was less than a BJ in a car. I explained this to her in what I consider to be a calm manner. I was still furious with her, but I didn't let it show in my voice. I think that was hard for her to hear, and she looked like she was about to have a nervous breakdown. I explained this all to her and then circled back to remind her that not only did she cheat, but she attacked me physically for catching her and being a good son and telling my dad. Now, tears were openly flowing from her as I explained that had the situation been reversed, I would have told her if I had caught dad cheating. She broke down completely at this point. I finished the conversation by explaining to her that all of that aside, the fact that she blamed me for everything showed what kind of person she was. The last thing I said was that we could rekindle our relationship when she figured out how to go back in time and not blame a 14-year-old for the series of events that led to his family blowing up and, ultimately, the death of his father. My very last words to her as I turned to collect my family was that she would die alone without ever being part of my life. She killed my dad, and I cannot find it in myself to forgive that. Maybe I am the a-hole. If so, I guess I'll live with it.
I only post new and unique content. Please like and subscribe.